Hi. I'd also like to begin by thanking Olive-Harvey College for hosting this debate, Professor Sweis for organizing it and for moderating it, and for all of you for coming out and participating. I'm not as seasoned a debater as Paul is, so I'm going to be reading at least my opening statement, and I'm also not going to be, I'm going to be more stationary than he was. You might have thought, coming here tonight, that this would be a debate between the political left and the political right, with Paul representing the liberal side of the political spectrum and me representing the conservative side, but that's not right. I'm representing both liberals and conservatives. And if you think I'm exaggerating, ask Paul, because he'll agree to that. I voted for President Obama in the last election, and I intend to vote for him again this year. I don't vote for Barack Obama despite supporting capitalism. I vote for him as a supporter of capitalism. President Obama is on my side of this table. In fact, every Democrat, President Obama, Vice President Biden, Secretary of State Clinton, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, and every other Democrat who's elected to high office, and in fact, who's elected to local office, all of our state and city officials, all of them are on my side of the stage, so it's a crowded side of the stage. The disagreements between Democrats and Republicans are real, substantive, important disagreements, but they're disagreements between people who accept capitalism as common ground. Now, why do they all do that? Why do people who disagree about so many other things, who disagree about how high taxes should be and the morality of abortion and capital punishment and public education and war and medical insurance and 1,000 other things, why do they all accept capitalism and reject communism? The answer is simple. They know that the picture of the world generally and of our country in particular that Paul just gave you isn't the truth. It isn't accurate. And I want to say that I know that Paul isn't lying. He sincerely believes what he just said. It's just that I think it's factually not correct. In particular, Democrats and Republicans alike, all of them, so the Mitt Romneys and the Barack Obamas, the Ronald Reagans and the Bill Clintons, the Richard Nixons and the John F. Kennedys, they all know two things, and those two things are my argument for capitalism and against communism. So first, they know that the quality of life for human beings living in capitalist countries has risen dramatically in virtually every single measurable way. And capitalism got started a few hundred years ago. It's sort of accelerated in the last, let's say, 150 to 200 years, and especially in the last 100 years. By quality of life, I mean, in particular, two things. I'm going to focus on two things: material well-being and the enjoyment of basic rights and freedoms. So let me give you some specific examples, starting with material well-being and focusing on the United States in particular. So every person in this room has a much higher life expectancy than the average American 100 years ago. In fact, the average life has doubled in length. We now get 2 of their lifetimes on average. Why is that? There are many reasons. It's a complicated story, but one reason is that 100 years ago, huge numbers of people died from diseases that they got from not washing, and they didn't wash because they had little or no access to running water. Now everyone in this room has hot and cold running water. We take it all for granted, but we shouldn't take it for granted. 100 years ago, people didn't have it. 100 years ago, there was almost no answer in terms of medicine and surgery to any medical problem. If you got sick, you died, or you stayed sick your whole life. Now everyone in this room has access to a level of medical care, and that's in terms of 1,000 things, antibiotics and cancer treatments and heart medications, that princes and presidents didn't have 100 years ago. In short, we all live much longer because for the first time in the history of the world, we've developed a system of medicine and hygiene that allows those high life expectancies. Again, it can seem like these improvements come out of nowhere, but they don't. They come out of capitalism, and I'll talk more later about how they come out of capitalism. So that's life expectancy and health. Here's another class of examples. Everyone needs food and clothing and shelter, and historically, most people did not have enough of these things, and many, many people died every year from a lack of more than one or more of them. In the United States, that isn't true anymore. Every person in this room has more buying power, has more access to food, clothing, and shelter than most people 100 years ago. In fact, the median household income for people living at the official poverty line in the United States is now the same as it was for the middle class in 1971, just to give you some sense of the arc or the vector. Just to give one concrete example, everybody in this room, or almost everybody, buys ketchup at the supermarket. But 100 years ago, rich people would put bottles of ketchup out when they had guests over because, just to show how rich they were, because no one who wasn't wealthy could afford to buy bottles of ketchup. Now we all can buy bottles of ketchup. The list of these things is very, very long. I can't begin to go through all of it. I'll just mention a couple more examples. So 100 years ago, only the wealthy had access to central heating, and the richest people in the world didn't have air conditioning. Now, virtually all of us have central heating, and 4 in 5 Americans living at the official government poverty line have air conditioning. If wealthy people living just 100 years ago could see how everyone in this room lives, if they could see, just in terms of ketchup and health care and central heating and electricity and cars and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and refrigerators and microwaves and televisions and computers and DVD players and access to education, which again was extremely rare until quite recently, and to means of communication, they would say that we were all wealthy. To repeat, we take these things for granted. We all, it's just natural. We assimilate them into what we simply expect out of life. But we shouldn't. They don't come from nowhere. It takes a certain kind of society to produce them, a certain kind of system, and that system is capitalism. I've just given a bunch of examples of how people living in capitalist countries have a much higher quality of life in material terms. Let me say a word about rights and freedoms. So, until quite recently in human history, there were no democracies. Everyone lived under a king or a dictator or a czar. There were no elections. In virtually every society, there was slavery. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no freedom of association, no freedom of the choice of work that you had. The spreading of democracy and the securing of these rights goes hand in hand with the rise of capitalism. There's a direct relationship, and it's a causal relationship. Everyone in this room gets a vote. Everybody in this room can say what they like to whoever they like. Everybody in this room can practice the religion they choose to practice, or they can choose to practice no religion. Everyone in this room can choose what job they take, and they can quit when they want to quit. Again, it's easy to take all of these things for granted. But for almost all of the approximately 100 billion people who have lived since humanity first came into existence, none of that was true. Something started to change just a few hundred years ago, and it's accelerated in the last 100 years, and that something was the coming of capitalism. How much time do I have? Yeah, how much? 3.5? Okay, good, thank you. I said that President Obama and all other elected representatives support capitalism because they know two things. And the first thing, which I've just summarized, is that we have capitalism to thank for an enormous increase in our living standards, both in terms of material well-being and in terms of rights and freedoms. To bring out the second thing that they all know, which explains why they support capitalism, I'd like to draw your attention to a fact about Paul's opening statement, and I think it's probably going to be true for the rest of what he says tonight. One thing you may have noticed about that statement was that it was an attack on capitalism, but there was a lack of any reference to the contrast, to actual communist countries, countries with a communist economic structure. You might expect tonight to hear somebody defending communism compare capitalist countries like the United States and England and Canada and France and Germany and Italy and Australia and South Korea and Japan, to name just a few, with their communist alternatives to bring out how much better the communist countries are. Paul didn't do that, and I think he's probably not going to do that tonight. And the reason, again, is simple. He knows that the countries that have adopted communism, countries like the Soviet Union from 1917 until its collapse in 1991, China from the late 1940s until its recent capitalist makeover, Cambodia in the 1970s, and North Korea right now, just to name a few, are all much, much worse in every measurable way than any of the capitalist countries I just mentioned, or any of dozens of other capitalist nations. In fact, they aren't just worse. Communist countries have been, at least typically, total nightmares to live in. They've been characterized by mass starvation, mass murder, and brutal dictatorships that eliminated every basic human right. These are countries so bad that people routinely risk their lives to escape from them. No one ever risks his or her life to escape from America, and that isn't just because, unlike in these communist countries, we're all free to go whenever we want. It's also because everybody around the world knows that capitalist countries are places with a high quality of life, rich opportunities, and an abundance of basic freedoms. That's why in a typical year, America accepts more immigrants than every other nation on earth combined. People vote with their feet, and people aren't stupid. They know whether they're coming from India or Ghana or Sweden or Nicaragua, that the terrible difficulties that they face in pulling up their roots and leaving their homelands are outweighed by the life that they and their children can have here. I worked as a busboy a few years ago, and the guy that I worked with was a guy named Osei from Ghana in West Africa. And he had come here, he had to leave his wife and child. He had to save up enough money to pay for them to come too. And he loved his country, he loved Ghana. We talked a lot about it. But when he had the chance to come to the US, he didn't think twice about it. He immediately came. It was just obvious to him that this was the right thing to do for him and his family, even though it meant, coming to a country where he didn't know the language, coming to a country where he had no friends, having to wait to see his family for another year and a half. That's the sort of that's an illustration of just what people know around the world about the United States. So that's why. Oh, am I out of time? Time up. All right.
Dr. Gomberg, you have 5 minutes for your rebuttal.